Halloween had always been our thing. Every year, we upped the ante with more elaborate costumes, scarier decorations, and bigger parties. But this year, we wanted to do something different, something darker, more thrilling. It was Taylor's idea, as usual. He had a knack for finding just the right kind of trouble. "There's this house," he said one night over drinks. "It's been abandoned for decades. People say it's haunted, that people went missing there in the 90s, and no one ever figured out what happened. Perfect for a Halloween party, right?" We were all in. Who could resist a good ghost story on Halloween? There were 6 of us. Me, Taylor, his girlfriend Emily, and the rest of our usual crew, Mason, Katie, and Jess. We'd all heard the rumors about the house, of course. Locals called it Grimwood Manor, and there were whispered stories of cults, strange rituals, and dark secrets. But we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We thought it was just a run-down old place with a spooky reputation. At least that's what we told ourselves. The house was exactly what you'd expect from a place with that kind of history. It loomed at the edge of the woods, crumbling but still somehow defiant against time. Tall, broken windows stared down at us like empty eyes, and the air around it felt colder than it should have, even for October. We walked in with bags full of booze, decorations, and of course, a Ouija board. Because what's Halloween without a little ghost hunting? Inside, the place was a wreck. The furniture was covered in sheets, thick with dust, and the walls were yellowed with age. Spiderwebs hung in the corners like nature's own decorations. It was perfect. As the night wore on, the party got going. We had music blasting, the smell of alcohol mixing with the stale air of the house. We laughed, danced, and took pictures of ourselves in ridiculous costumes. For a while, it was just like any other Halloween party, until Taylor decided it was time for the real fun to start. "You guys ready to summon some spirits?" he asked, pulling the Ouija board out of his bag with a grin. We gathered around a large wooden table in what must have once been the dining room. It was dimly lit by the flickering candles we'd brought, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The mood shifted instantly. Everyone seemed a little on edge now, but no one wanted to be the first to back out. "Come on," Katie said, her voice just a bit too high-pitched to be convincing. "It's all just for fun. Let's see if any ghosts want to join the party." We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette. The rules were simple. Ask questions, and let the spirits move the planchette to spell out answers. At first, it was a joke. We asked dumb things like, "Is anyone here with us?" and "Who's going to get the drunkest tonight?" Nothing happened. The planchette stayed still, and the atmosphere started to lighten again. That's when Emily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all night, leaned forward and said, "Ask something real." The way she said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, seemed darker, almost hollow. Taylor, clearly loving the tension, asked the question that changed everything. "If there's anyone here with us, show us." For a moment, nothing happened. We all sat there, staring at each other in nervous silence, waiting for someone to make a joke to break the tension. But no one did. Then the planchette moved. Slowly at first, but unmistakably, it glided across the board. No one spoke. Our fingers followed it, frozen in place as it spelled out a single word: "Leave." A nervous laugh escaped Jess, but it was shaky, forced. "Okay, who's messing with us?" No one answered. The room felt colder now, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at Taylor, expecting to see that mischievous grin on his face, but he looked just as freaked out as the rest of us. "Let's stop," Mason said, pulling his hands away from the board. "This isn't funny anymore." But Taylor wasn't ready to give up. "Wait, let's just ask one more thing." Before anyone could object, he leaned in and asked, "Who are you?" The planchette moved again, faster this time, as though whatever was controlling it was eager to respond. "Death." Emily stood up so fast her chair toppled over. "I'm done," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't funny." I wanted to leave too, but something kept me there. Maybe it was the same morbid curiosity that had brought us to that house in the first place. Taylor, always the daredevil, pushed his luck. "Prove it," he whispered. For a second, nothing happened. We all sat there, staring at the board, our breaths held, waiting. Then the candles flickered. All at once, the air felt thick, almost suffocating. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, we heard it. A low, rasping breath. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too deliberate, too close. Jess screamed, and that was enough to break the spell. We all jumped up, knocking the Ouija board to the floor. Taylor, looking pale for the first time that night, quickly gathered his stuff. "Okay, that was creepy," he admitted, trying to laugh it off. "Let's get out of here." We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed our things and made a beeline for the door. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief, like we'd narrowly avoided something terrible. But as we walked back to our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. No one said much on the drive back to Taylor's apartment, where we'd planned to crash for the night. The party mood was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. When we got back, we all tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to Halloween nerves and too much alcohol. But something had changed. We all felt it. We just didn't know how to say it. That night, as we all tried to sleep in the cramped living room, I kept hearing things. Strange, soft noises, just on the edge of perception. A creak, a whisper, the sound of footsteps that weren't there. I told myself it was just the old building, or maybe one of the others moving around, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling before I finally drifted off. But when I did, I dreamed of the house. In the dream, I was back in that dark dining room, sitting at the table, the Ouija board in front of me. Only this time, I was alone. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out a message just for me. "You can't escape." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. But it wasn't just the dream that had woken me. Something else was wrong. The room was too quiet. I glanced around, expecting to see the others sprawled out in their sleeping bags, but they weren't there. The living room was empty. Panic set in as I stumbled to my feet, calling their names. "Taylor? Emily? Guys?" No answer. That's when I heard it again. That same low, rasping breath from the house, coming from the hallway. My blood turned to ice as that rasping breath echoed through the hallway. It wasn't the sound of someone snoring or half asleep. It was something else, something wrong. I froze, my mind racing. Maybe it was just one of the others messing with me, trying to scare me after what happened at the house. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, the light from the screen briefly illuminating the darkened room. 2:33 a.m. I dialed Taylor's number, my fingers trembling. The ringing seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the apartment. No answer. I tried Mason next. Then Jess. Nothing. My mind started to spiral, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. Where the hell were they? They couldn't have just left, could they? A soft creak came from the hallway, and I turned toward the sound. My throat felt tight, my breathing shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment, but I couldn't just abandon my friends. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another until I was standing at the threshold of the hallway. The shadows seemed darker here, deeper. The air felt thick, suffocating just like it had in the house. "Taylor?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Nothing. I took another step, then froze. There, just at the edge of the hallway, was a shape. At first it looked like one of the others, maybe Mason, standing with his back to me. But something was off. The figure was too still, too rigid. And the longer I stared, the more I realized that it wasn't standing at all. It was hovering. My heart thundered in my chest as the figure slowly turned to face me. It wasn't Mason. It wasn't anyone. Its face was a dark, featureless void, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to pull the light into it, erasing everything in its wake. And then, from that blackness, came the sound. That breath. Low, ragged, unnatural. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But before I could move, it lunged at me. The world spun as I hit the floor, my breath knocked from my lungs. For a moment, I couldn't see anything. The room seemed to close in, the shadows thickening, suffocating. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure was gone. I lay there, gasping for air, my heart pounding so loudly, I thought it might explode. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it, that the fear and the darkness were playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me. I scrambled to my feet, my body running on pure adrenaline now. I didn't know where I was going or what I was running from, but I couldn't stay here. I burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't stop running until I reached the street, my legs burning, lungs aching. I looked back at the apartment, expecting to see something, but the building was dark and silent. It looked perfectly normal, perfectly still. But I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My fingers shook so badly I almost dropped it, but I managed to hit the call button. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and steady, but I could barely focus on what she was saying. I stammered out something about my friends, about the house, about the thing in the hallway. But it all sounded insane, even to me. "They're gone," I said finally, my voice cracking. "They're all gone. The cops came within 20 minutes. They searched the apartment, asked me 1,000 questions, but found nothing. No signs of struggle, no evidence of anyone being there besides me. It was like my friends had simply vanished. Taylor, Emily, Mason, Jess, Katie, they were just gone." I tried to explain about the house, about the Ouija board, but the more I talked, the crazier it sounded. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? The official report listed them as missing persons. Foul play wasn't suspected, but there was no explanation, no answers, and I was left with nothing but the cold, hard truth. They were never coming back. The days passed, then weeks. The police investigation went nowhere. Taylor's parents put out missing posters. The local news ran a few segments, but as time went on, the world moved on. People forgot, but I couldn't. Every night I saw that thing, that faceless figure hovering in the shadows. I heard the rasping breath, felt its presence lingering in the dark corners of every room I stepped into. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the trauma messing with my head. But deep down, I knew better. The worst part was that I started seeing them, my friends, not in dreams, but in mirrors, in reflections, in brief flashes at the edge of my vision. I'd turn, and for just a second, I'd see Emily standing in the corner of my room, her eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Or Mason, sitting on the edge of my bed, his back turned, his head hanging low like he was waiting for something. But when I looked again, they were gone. Just like that thing. I started to lose track of time, of days. Sleep was impossible. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of that breath, waiting for the thing in the shadows to return. But it didn't need to. It was already inside me, in my mind, in my soul. It was about 2 months after that night at the house when I finally broke. I was sitting alone in my apartment, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV show, when the lights flickered. The TV cut out, plunging the room into darkness. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. That breath. Low. Rasping. Closer than ever before. I didn't even have the energy to run anymore. I just sat there frozen, waiting for whatever came next. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath in the darkness. And then I felt it, cold, bony fingers brushing the back of my neck. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my throat. There, standing just inches from me, was Emily. Or what used to be Emily. Her eyes were black pits, her skin pale and stretched too tight over her bones. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she whispered two words: "Join us." I never left the house after that. There was no point. Whatever I had brought back from that night at Grimwood Manor, it was with me now, in the shadows, in the mirrors, in my mind. The others were gone, swallowed up by the darkness, by the thing we had summoned. And soon I knew it would take me too. As I sit here writing this, I can feel it watching me. It's waiting. It always is. I don't know how much longer I can hold it off. But if you're reading this, if you ever find yourself tempted to play with something you don't understand, don't. Because once you open the door, you can't close it. But I hear the breath now. It's here. I hear the breath now. I've lived in Clearbrook my entire life, but the last few months, it's felt like anything but clear. The fog rolled in one evening in late July and it never left. At first we thought it was just a weird weather pattern, maybe some unusual humidity from the lake or something. But when the mist hung around for days, then weeks, people started talking. It wasn't like any fog I'd ever seen before. It wasn't just that it was thick, it was alive, shifting, swirling in strange ways, even when there was no wind. It didn't follow the rules of nature. Some days it would creep low to the ground, making the streets feel like they were half submerged. Other days, it rose higher, swallowing entire buildings until you couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of you. And at night, God, at night it was like the whole town had been plunged into some sort of limbo. No light could cut through it. Not streetlights, not headlights, not even the sun. It was like being trapped in a world without any real edges. People started avoiding the misty streets as much as they could, especially at night. There were whispers, rumors, stories of people who'd gone missing in the fog, never to return. At first, we chalked it up to bad luck or accidents. Maybe they'd gotten lost or wandered too far. Clearbrook was surrounded by thick woods, and it wasn't unheard of for someone to get disoriented, especially with all the fog. But then the disappearances started happening in town, right under our noses. It began with Alan Rowe. He was just walking home from the diner one evening, less than a block from his house. His wife said she saw him heading down the street, the fog swirling around his legs, but then he never made it to the front door. They found his phone on the sidewalk the next morning, screen shattered like he'd dropped it in a hurry. No one saw or heard anything. Then it was Mrs. Jeffers, the elderly woman who lived near the park. She never went anywhere without her dog, a little terrier that barked at everything. One morning, someone found the dog, its leash dragging behind it, whimpering at the edge of the fog. Mrs. Jeffers was gone. Just like that. Vanished. Clearbrook was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. So when people started disappearing without a trace, folks got scared. The town held meetings, the sheriff organized search parties, but it was like the fog swallowed them whole. No clues, no bodies, nothing. After the fourth person went missing, the town finally did what small towns do best. We went quiet. No one talked about it. No one wanted to believe it was happening. We just went about our days, pretending everything was fine, as if ignoring it would make the fog go away. But it didn't. I didn't think much of it at first. My family owned the general store on Main Street, and most days I stayed late to restock shelves or do inventory. Business had slowed since the fog came in, and people weren't going out much unless they had to. On the rare occasion someone did come in, it was mostly for essentials. A lot of folks had started ordering things online, even though deliveries had become unpredictable. Some days the trucks made it through, other times they didn't. We were all trying to adapt. One night, just after closing, I was finishing up some paperwork when I heard something outside. At first, it was just a faint scratching noise, like branches against a window. But there were no trees close enough to the store to make that sound. I got up, figuring it was an animal, maybe a stray looking for scraps. But when I stepped out the back door, the fog was so thick I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. The air was unnaturally still, heavy. I called out, hoping to scare off whatever it was, but my voice barely seemed to carry. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving in the mist, just beyond the edge of my vision. It was quick, darting from side to side, and at first I thought it was a trick of the light. But the more I squinted, the more certain I became that someone was out there. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. No response. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. The fog swirled around me, thick and cold. That's when I heard it. Not the usual rustling of wind or leaves, but a sound that sent chills straight down my spine. A low, guttural growl, almost like an animal but deeper, more primal. My heart started racing, and I backed up toward the door, my fingers fumbling for the handle. Suddenly, the shadow in the mist surged forward. I barely caught a glimpse. Just a vague shape, long and twisted, with limbs that didn't move like they should. It was huge, larger than any person or animal I'd ever seen. And it was fast, moving through the fog like it was part of it. I slammed the door shut just as the growling intensified. For a few moments, I stood there in the darkness of the store, holding my breath, listening to the sounds outside. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like claws raking against the walls. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. I stood frozen, waiting for some sign that it was gone, but the fog outside remained thick and impenetrable. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just outside the walls of the store. The next morning, I found long, deep gashes in the back door. They were too big to be from any animal I knew. My gut told me it was no animal at all. My breath caught in my throat as the figure turned towards us. It didn't move like anything I had ever seen. Its limbs elongated and twisted in impossible ways, bending as if the very laws of physics had no hold on it. The mist swirled around it, almost as though the fog itself was a part of its body, and for a moment, I felt like I was staring at something ancient and unknowable. Katie stood frozen beside me, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Dad?" she whispered again, her voice fragile, as if she was clinging to some desperate hope that the thing in the mist could somehow still be her father. But it wasn't. Whatever it was something much worse. The creature took a step forward, its body shifting and stretching unnaturally, and the mist thickened, swirling around its limbs like tendrils. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We needed to move, and fast. "Katie!" I grabbed her arm, pulling her out of her daze. "Run!" She snapped out of it, and we bolted back toward the house. The flashlight beam danced wildly in the fog, barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. Behind us, I could hear the faint sound of something slithering, no, gliding, through the mist. It was following us, its presence like a creeping weight on the back of my mind. We reached the back porch, breathless, and slammed the door behind us. I locked it out of instinct, though a flimsy door wasn't going to stop whatever was out there. Katie collapsed into a chair, her face pale and her hands shaking. I could see tears brimming in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She was in shock, but there was something else too, an emptiness, a kind of resignation. Her dad wasn't coming back. "We need to call the sheriff," I said, my voice barely steady. Someone has to do something about that thing. Katie didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I dialed the sheriff's office, but the phone rang endlessly, the line never connecting. I tried again. Same result. "They're not answering," I muttered, feeling my stomach drop. The town was small, but the sheriff's office always had someone on duty. It wasn't normal for no one to pick up. "I don't think they can help us," Katie said softly, finally looking up. Her eyes were wide, but there was a strange clarity in them, like she was starting to accept something I wasn't ready to. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Katie swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "My dad. He'd been talking about the fog for weeks. Said it wasn't natural. He tried to tell people, tried to warn them that something was out there, but no one listened. They thought he was losing it. And now..." She trailed off, her eyes filling with fresh tears. I wanted to reassure her, tell her that everything would be fine, that we just needed to wait it out until the fog cleared. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The fog wasn't going to clear, not on its own. And that thing in the mist, it was hunting. The hours dragged on, the weight of dread settling heavier and heavier around us. We sat in silence, both too afraid to speak much, jumping at every sound that came from outside the house. Every creak of the floor, every distant rustle of leaves outside made us tense, our imaginations running wild. The fog outside pressed against the windows, so thick it was like staring into a wall of gray nothingness. Occasionally I thought I saw shapes moving in the mist, but I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Katie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know what to do. No one did. I had never been so powerless in my life, but we couldn't stay here forever, locked in a house while that thing stalked the streets outside. I thought about the others who had gone missing. Alan Rowe, Mrs. Jeffers, Andy Wilkes, and I realized with a sickening certainty that none of them had just gotten lost in the fog. They had been taken by whatever was lurking out there, the same thing that was now after us. "We can't stay here," I finally said. "We have to find help. Maybe if we get to the edge of town, the fog won't be as thick. Maybe we can get to the main road and..." Katie shook her head, cutting me off. "There's no escaping it. The fog, it's not just around the town. It is the town now. And that thing, it's in the fog. Everywhere." Her words sank in, heavy and final, like a stone dropping into water. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. The fog wasn't natural. It wasn't something we could just drive out of or wait for the sun to burn away. It was alive in a way, an extension of the thing that hunted within it. I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing. There has to be a way. Maybe if we stick to the streetlights, we can... A sound outside cut me off. At first it was faint, almost like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder, a scraping, slithering noise that made my blood run cold. It was back. Katie stood too, her eyes wide with terror. "It's here," she whispered. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, though I knew it wouldn't be much help. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and swirling, and through it, I could see the shadowy figure again, moving slowly, deliberately, like it was savoring the hunt. "We need to go!" I shouted, grabbing Katie's arm. I yanked open the front door, the mist curling inside like fingers reaching for us. We had no plan, no destination, just the primal urge to run. We bolted into the fog, the cold, damp air clinging to us as we sprinted down the street. The fog seemed thicker than ever, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. Every step felt like it was taking us deeper into an abyss, but we couldn't stop. The slithering, scraping noise grew louder behind us, and I could feel the presence of the creature closing in, its inhuman movements echoing through the mist. "Keep going!" I shouted, my voice strained with panic. But then Katie tripped. I heard her cry out as she hit the ground, and I skidded to a stop, turning back for her. The fog was so thick I could barely see her, but I reached down, grabbing her arm to pull her up. That's when I saw it. The thing in the mist was right behind her. Its twisted, shadowy form loomed over her, limbs stretching unnaturally, its head tilting in that grotesque, otherworldly way. I could see its face, or at least what passed for a face, hidden in the shifting fog. Hollow black eyes stared back at me, filled with an ancient hunger. I pulled Katie to her feet, and we ran. But it was too late. I could feel the fog closing in around us, tightening like a noose. The creature was faster, closer, and no matter how hard we ran, we couldn't escape it. Suddenly, Katie stopped. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and resignation. "Go," she said, her voice breaking. "It's after me. You still have a chance." "No!" I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her with me, but she shook her head, her face pale and resolute. "I can't outrun it," she whispered. "But you can. Please, go." Before I could protest, she pushed me, hard, sending me stumbling forward. I turned back just in time to see the fog swallow her whole. The last thing I heard was her scream, piercing and terrified, before it was cut off by the sound of that terrible, low growl. I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, the fog swirling around me, thick and oppressive. The creature was still there, somewhere behind me, but it wasn't after me now. It had taken what it wanted. It had taken Katie. I kept running, even when my legs burned and my lungs screamed for air. I didn't stop until I was far from town, where the fog finally thinned and the world felt real again. But even then, I knew the truth. The fog hadn't just taken Katie. It had taken the town too, and no one was ever going to escape. Not really. I've left Clearbrook now, but the fog still follows me. It's in my dreams, in the corners of my mind, and sometimes I think I can still hear the faint sound of slithering, just beyond the edges of my vision, and I know that someday it'll find me again. When we first moved into the old estate, I thought it was like something out of a fairy tale. A huge, sprawling house with tall windows and ivy crawling up the stone walls. It stood on the edge of a small town, surrounded by thick woods that whispered with the wind. My parents had bought it for next to nothing, a bargain too good to pass up, they said. My sister Lily and I had never seen anything like it. We spent the first few days exploring every nook and cranny, running down hallways that seemed to stretch forever, peeking into rooms with creaky wooden floors, and staring up at ceilings painted with intricate designs that looked like they belonged in a museum. But there was one room we hadn't found at first. It was tucked away at the back of the house, behind a door that had been sealed shut, its hinges rusted and worn. It wasn't until the third or fourth day that my dad finally managed to pry it open. Inside, it looked like a forgotten relic of a different time. The room was filled with old, dusty furniture, an antique vanity, a cracked mirror, and most notably, an enormous, ornately carved dollhouse that stood in the corner, its windows dark and empty. Lily was the one who found it first. She was immediately drawn to it, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Look at this!" she exclaimed, running her fingers over the tiny, intricately detailed roof. The dollhouse was a perfect miniature replica of the house we'd just moved into. The more I looked at it, the more unsettling it became. Every little detail was right, down to the ivy creeping up the sides, and the old cracked shutters on the windows. It was uncanny. "It's creepy," I muttered, but Lily was fascinated. She opened the front door of the dollhouse and peered inside. That's when we saw them. The dolls. They were positioned throughout the rooms inside the dollhouse, each one standing perfectly still, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. But what struck me wasn't just how lifelike they were. It was that they looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. "Wait a minute," I said, stepping closer. "Is it just me? Or do these dolls look like us?" Lily laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in her voice. Come on, they're just dolls. But as we examined them more closely, the resemblance was undeniable. There was a doll of my dad, standing in what looked like the miniature version of his office, holding a tiny book. There was one of my mom, sitting at a little dining table. And then there was Lily and me, our dolls posed in what looked like the upstairs bedrooms. "Mom! Dad! You've got to see this!" Lily called out. But something about the dolls made me uneasy. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow me, and their painted expressions were frozen in strange, blank smiles. My parents came into the room, and when they saw the dollhouse, they seemed just as fascinated as Lily was. My dad admired the craftsmanship, talking about how valuable it must be, and my mom marveled at the detail. No one seemed to think it was weird that the dolls looked like us. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't stop thinking about the dollhouse and those dolls with their lifeless eyes. I wanted to ask my parents about it, but I knew they wouldn't take me seriously. They'd just tell me it was an old antique, a coincidence, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. The next morning, things got stranger. I woke up to the sound of Lily screaming. I ran into her room and found her standing by the window, her face pale. "My doll," she said, her voice shaking. "It's broken." She held up the little doll that looked like her. One of its arms had snapped off, and the face was cracked, a jagged line splitting across its porcelain cheek. "I didn't touch it," she insisted, her voice rising in panic. "I swear, I didn't." I looked down at the broken doll, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. "Maybe it just fell over," I said, trying to reassure her. "It's old. It was probably fragile." But Lily wasn't convinced, and neither was I. Later that day, we found something even worse. My dad had gone into town for groceries and hadn't come back. We tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. My mom called the store, but they said he'd never shown up. By evening, the panic was setting in. My mom called the police, but they couldn't find him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on a door. I sat up in bed, listening. The house was quiet, except for that persistent tap, tap, tap. I crept out of bed and followed the sound. It was coming from the back room, the room with the dollhouse. As I stepped inside, the air felt colder, and the light from the hallway barely reached the corners of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was the dollhouse. Its door was open, and the dolls were no longer in their places. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it, dread clawing at my throat. The dolls had moved. The little doll of my dad was no longer standing in his office. It was lying in the middle of the hallway inside the dollhouse, crumpled and broken, its limbs twisted at odd angles. I stumbled back, gasping. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The dollhouse, it wasn't just a replica. It was connected to us. Somehow the things that happened to the dolls were happening to us. And my dad's doll, it was broken, just like he had disappeared. The next morning, I told my mom everything. I showed her the broken dolls, explained the strange tapping sound I'd heard, and how the doll of my dad had moved on its own. But she didn't believe me. She was too worried, too desperate to find any logical explanation for my dad's disappearance. "It's just a dollhouse," she said, her voice shaky. "We're all under a lot of stress. You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining it. I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong with that house, with the dolls. And it wasn't just my dad who was in danger. We all were. Things escalated quickly after that. Lily's doll was next. We found it the following morning, slumped against the tiny window of the dollhouse, one of its legs broken clean off. And later that day, Lily collapsed. We rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain what had happened. It was like her leg had snapped out of nowhere, just like the doll's. Now, my mom was starting to believe me, but it was too late. We were trapped in that house, and the dolls were watching us. After Lily's collapse, my mother was no longer in denial. The terror in her eyes was unmistakable now. She sat by Lily's hospital bed, holding her hand, her face pale and drawn. Lily was sedated, her leg wrapped in a cast, but the doctors had no explanation for how it had broken so suddenly. It was as if the bone had just snapped without any external force. I stayed at the hospital that night, but I barely slept. I couldn't stop thinking about the dollhouse, the way the dolls had moved, how they mirrored what was happening to us. The next morning I told my mom we had to leave the house. We had to get as far away from it as possible. "We'll leave tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling. "We'll sell it, burn it, whatever it takes." But part of me knew it wouldn't be that simple. The house, the dollhouse, wasn't going to let us go. That night, after we returned from the hospital, the house was eerily quiet. My mother wanted to sleep, but I couldn't let it go. I knew I had to confront the dollhouse, to understand why it was doing this to us before it was too late. Around midnight, when the house was still, I slipped out of bed and crept down the hall toward the room with the dollhouse. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the cold air hit me like a wave. The dollhouse was sitting there in the center of the room, looming in the dim light from the hallway. I felt my hand shake as I approached it. I didn't want to see what had changed, but I knew I had to look. Inside, the dolls had moved again. My dad's doll was still lying in the hallway, twisted and broken, just as we had found it before. Lily's doll was now lying in a tiny bed, its legs still cracked, mirroring her state in the hospital. And then I saw it, the doll of my mother. It was no longer sitting at the dining table like before. Now, it was in the kitchen, standing next to a tiny stove. One of its arms was bent awkwardly behind its back, as if something terrible was about to happen. And then there was my doll. My heart stopped when I saw where it was placed. It was in the attic of the dollhouse, standing by a tiny window, its face turned toward the door, as if it was watching, waiting. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around, and there, standing in the doorway, was my mother. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, but there was something else. Something wrong. She was holding a kitchen knife. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But she didn't respond. She took a slow, shuffling step toward me, her arm moving in that same unnatural way as the doll in the kitchen. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "Mom, stop!" I shouted, but she didn't seem to hear me. Her eyes were blank, as if she wasn't really there anymore, as if something else was controlling her. I grabbed the nearest object, a small wooden chair, and held it in front of me as a weak defense. She stepped closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. And then, just as she raised the knife, her body jerked violently, as if some invisible force had yanked her backwards. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, the knife clattering out of her hand. I rushed to her side, pulling the knife away and tossing it aside. She blinked, her eyes finally focusing on me, as if she'd just woken from a nightmare. What happened?" she whispered, her voice shaky and weak. I didn't have the heart to tell her. I didn't have the words. After that night, we didn't waste any more time. We packed up what little we could and left the house the next morning. My mom, still shaken, didn't argue. We didn't care about the furniture or the antiques or anything else. We just needed to get out. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching us. And the dollhouse. I knew it wasn't done with us yet. I could feel its presence lingering in the back of my mind, like a shadow that had followed us. We stayed in a cheap motel that night, far from the house. Lily was still in the hospital, so it was just me and my mom. We barely spoke. The fear was too fresh, too real. I kept replaying that moment when my mom had come after me with the knife, and the look in her eyes, like she wasn't herself, like something else had taken over. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was over, that we had escaped. But deep down, I knew the truth. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe from the room next door. But then I realized it was closer, inside the room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the closet. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me to. Slowly, I got out of bed and approached the closet door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I pulled it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness of the room. Inside, in the middle of the floor, was the dollhouse. My blood turned to ice. I had left it behind. We had left it behind in the house. But here it was, sitting in the closet of the motel room, just as it had been in that cursed room. The dolls had moved again. My mother's doll was lying on the floor now, its body twisted in the same way she had collapsed in the house. Lily's doll was still in bed, unmoved. And then there was my doll. It was no longer in the attic. It was now sitting in the living room of the dollhouse, holding something in its tiny hand. I bent down to get a closer look, my hands trembling. The doll was holding a tiny, perfect replica of the kitchen knife my mom had used. A cold dread settled over me as I realized what the dollhouse was trying to tell me. It wasn't done with us yet. The next day, my mom and I went back to the hospital to check on Lily. The doctors said she was stable, but they still couldn't explain what had happened to her leg. I didn't tell them about the dollhouse. They wouldn't believe me. No one would. But when I saw Lily, I knew. She was pale, her eyes wide and distant, and when she looked at me, I saw something in her gaze that made my stomach drop. She knew about the dollhouse too. That night we packed up the car and drove. We didn't stop until we were far away from Clearbrook, far from that cursed house. But the dollhouse, it followed us. Everywhere we went, it appeared. In closets, in basements, in the trunk of the car. No matter how far we ran, it found us. And with every day that passed, the dolls grew more lifelike, more twisted. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can hear the tapping again. It's in the next room, waiting for me. I don't know how much longer I can run. Because the dolls, they're coming for us. And soon, there will be nothing left but the dollhouse and its cursed inhabitants, just like my family.